Well, thanks very much for inviting me to kind of work with you today. In terms of kind of ways of working, I'm totally fine for you to interrupt, ask questions if I'm too quiet, too loud, I don't know what the other adjective could be, but just feel free to put your hand up and interrupt. Because we're being filmed, if you ask me a question, I'm going to repeat your question in my answer. It's not that I'm deaf or that other people didn't hear, but I'll just do that as a kind of piece of good housekeeping. And yeah, I'm looking forward to this session. So just because we're working with Cass Business School and various colleagues from higher education, certainly my introduction to thinking about this clash and intersection of art, of digital, of society, was through some stuff I did at University of Westminster very early on in my career around film and TV, but really it was just a cultural theory course. And I think Jean Baudrillard kind of, although in very kind of abstruse language, talks about the clash that we're in, the clash of a kind of making art that's about unique individual objects and ephemeral, unreproducible experiences. But he also understood as digital became embedded into our lives, that there would be a fundamental shift in our relationship with that art, with the people who created that art, with, in a sense, theories of authorship around that art. And I think we see that played out in our everyday, in our news, in our politics, for good and for ill. And hopefully we're all here today to think about how that might be for the better. This is the graveyard slot after lunch. So this is just a very quick exercise. So hands up who check their phones within 60 minutes of waking. Keep them up, keep them up, keep them up. Was there anyone without their hand up? Okay, 30 minutes, 15 minutes, 10 minutes, 5 minutes, which is about 49% of the room. I rest my case. Probably the people within 5 minutes are using their phones as their alarm clocks. Maybe, maybe not. Maybe they're very news obsessed. And in fact, I've been meaning to buy a new alarm clock since my last one broke for a very long time, because it's very bad sleep hygiene to have that mobile phone in your bedroom. Nevertheless, it's about recognizing in a changing world how we and our audiences, users, customers, whatever we're calling them, visitors, people's habits are changing. And you know, if you think your habits haven't changed, then look at your children or your nieces or your godchildren or a younger generation, and just be kind of gobsmacked when you actually closely observe their media habits and their cultural consumption habits compared to yours. Now, if I put these glasses on, I can see volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And in a sense, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about, in a sense, strategy. We're talking about planning. We're talking about capacity building, but in a kind of extremely turbulent situation. And there are various theories and studies around kind of approaches that you adopt in that. And I did promise that if I refer to things that weren't in my slides, I'll remember to insert extra slides to say what the reference is. But the Cinefin framework talks about ways of dealing with strategy and planning in those extremely turbulent settings. And the answer is to not plan and strategize too long, actually. The answer is to do and test and reflect, which I believe is quite a good method. One of our colleagues that we work with regularly on marketing and word of mouth and all of those kinds of things, he says, well, whatever the question is, the answer's video. And I kind of challenged him for the first 2 years of him saying that in workshops. And then depends on the topic, of course, depends on the subject matter, depends on the audience. But you know, the second biggest search engine after Google is YouTube, owned by Google. And the people who are perhaps slightly younger than us use it to search for facts, for news, for documentary, for everything, more than they use Google itself. And some other things, perhaps some prejudices that we have against the cross-media consumers. And there's kind of regularly some quite interesting market research. I really like the Ofcom media literacy surveys. They are really, really helpful. A note to self, must put that in as another reference. This middle stat from YouGov. Actually, the people who are across lots of screens, and there you are, you're reading and you're typing and you're doing other stuff, but are you concentrating on what I'm saying? Well, the research actually says quite often yes. And quite often, you will also notice stuff that's advertised to you and be really, really perceptive about lots of inputs, that kind of Baudrillard idea of us being almost this kind of receptacle for all the media that we have. And if I know today we're not looking at business models, but if we are looking at business models, then realizing that some of our assumptions around how business models work just don't apply when up to 27% of people have ad blockers on their mobile devices, then how does an advertising-based business model work? And that's out of date. That's like a year old, that. And this is kind of slightly, we're always in definition wars here, but I would posit a slightly different definition of innovation and encourage you to, in fact, I'm positing two, so I'm not even agreeing with myself, but to just think around this idea, because I think it is genuinely helpful to look at what you're trying to achieve. And there's something in this definition which is about replicability and viability, economic viability, and this idea of deliberate application. So it's not accidental, and creating of greater or different values. That's one definition. And another definition which is accepting that there is this idea of novelty, and I think in a sense that's where the creativity comes from, because creative practice comes up with new things. But it's also something around impact, and certainly I think part of the extended definition of the Wikipedia entry is around whether it is economic or social impact. And there's something about, you know, it's an innovation afterwards, because if it's had impact, it was an innovation. Now there are lots and lots and lots of technologies that we can think of, and lots of kind of creative practices that we can think of that were great and were very entertaining and that happened a few times, but they didn't really change the world. And those are the things that one could argue were creative acts, but they were not in themselves innovations. It's a kind of post hoc judgment. And we had the privilege to be commissioned by Nesta and Arts Council Wales to look at innovation in the arts sector. It says digital innovation at the top of the slide, and I think I did try and remove the word digital about 17 times during the process of writing the report. Especially in front of innovation, because I don't think there is such a thing as digital innovation. And I'm getting a nod from Sarah, which is always a good thing. There isn't such a thing as digital innovation. There's innovation, which is having an impact, usually, given that we're not in the world of cyborgs with people and organisations in social and political structures. And how could you not have a bit of digital technology given the decade we're in? That's the way round I see it, and that is the way round I'd recommend to see it. And the other thing, and I think Sarah and I have talked about this quite a lot, but there is a tendency to focus on the art end of the application of various technologies, rather than perhaps the more kind of sleep-inducing end of governance, board meetings, perhaps slightly more exciting fundraising, development, all of those kinds of things, lots of internal operations. This is not a very scientific diagram, but actually it is a diagram which is strangely resonant to people because it's not reflected any one particular org chart. And it's just in a sense got layers from very, very exciting to really, really boring. And you can exercise your creativity, and indeed you can use digital technologies, and you can use data, and you can use all kinds of methods as we've been introduced to this morning and that you'll be introduced to in the rest of the sessions of change in all of these functions. And I think oftentimes it is actually introducing change into many of these functions at the same time, which is the precondition for something being genuinely innovative and impactful. So I would argue, but others do not agree, that innovation is not creativity, but definitely innovation requires creativity, and that the creative use of digital and the use of digital in creativity does not necessarily give rise to innovation. And then there's something else about the impact thing, that post hoc definition, which is that the sustained impact comes from the novelty being embedded, which comes from repeatability and shareability, which comes from explicitly capturing knowledge. And actually, isn't that what research institutions are good at, colleagues? That's what universities, not the only thing they're for, but it's certainly one of the things that they're good at. And maybe that kind of sets a context for the relationship between the two. And the director of creative industries, his job title changes about once a month, but anyway, Hassan at Nesta said something which I think was quite useful here, which is that creativity and that research and development to come up with new working practices, whether they're at the creative end or the not so creative end of a creative organisation, they need to be codified. They need to be replicable. Your colleagues need to do them, not just you. A whole organisation needs to adopt them rather than just one kind of cabal or network within the organisation. And so talking of an example of that, and I'll add some URLs into this slide as well so that you can go to a case study. But we had the honour and privilege of working with colleagues at Arts Admin. I don't know who of you know Arts Admin, but they're, an amazingly multifarious organisation. There's only about 20 of them, and they turn over about 1.5 million turnover, something like that. And there they are with almost every possible service, product and asset that an arts organisation could ever have. So they've got their building, and they do artist development, and they do education, they do public engagement, they have venues, they tour, they produce their own stuff they produce for other people. And lots more besides. And so somehow by accident, because it certainly wasn't by design, we took on a project of basically trying to map out what a vision for data within arts organisations could be to create value, not to be a bit more efficient or be compliant or something tedious like that, but to create value. And this is an idea absolutely purloined from Fred Bolzer, who used to be the VP of marketing for Sony Music UK. He just said, kind of trying to step away from the traditional view of marketing, he just said, my job is to connect people to the stuff they love. And it just happens to be that I work in a music organisation. And he said if I went to work for someone else, I would still be connecting people to the stuff they love. And that really kind of resonated for me because there's an awful lot of stuff, and in your creative and cultural assets you'll have come up with enormously long lists, which we might very, very kind of just for shorthand call products, services, content, experiences, creative works, very, very broadly. But I'd be interested to see if there are things that don't fit into that definition. And then on this side, there's a long list, and it's quite small writing, but this is something that kind of started off when we started working at the Royal Shakespeare Company, because we noticed when everyone talked about audiences. And the thing is that people who trained in communications talk about audiences because that's kind of the language you use when you do comms. And then people who work in theatre talk about audiences because that's the people who've sat down and bought their ticket. But both definitions of audiences come with all of these assumptions of this person who receives a thing that someone else has decided. And it doesn't really cover the situation of a visitor quite. You know, is an audience a visitor always? Not always. It depends on the thing they're visiting. And it doesn't necessarily characterise the idea of customer, because if you pay for a ticket, you may have other people who didn't pay for the ticket. So strictly speaking, are they a customer? And actually, in the end, what we tried to say audiences, visitors, customers, something always, and everyone got bored saying that. And in the project, in the end of the RSC, we said people. And there's something magical about switching from audience to people, because it enables you to look at the people in multifaceted ways and understand how they are more than one thing at the same time, and how over time they are more than one thing, and that changes. And we believe, certainly in the work that we do, that is absolutely critical to looking at how value is created, because in a sense you're getting the model of who the beneficiary is right from the beginning and being rigorous about it. What we managed to do was to persuade arts admin that data was a strategic asset. That was the kind of the beginning. In the end, we all agreed that data is never about data. Data is always about people or creative works or how an organisation is performing. The data is almost never about data. So in fact, and the centre of gravity of the project for them was at this end. So the whole project became about relationships and managing relationships with people, individuals, organisations, networks in a much more strategic way. And then to some extent in the green bubble, the kind of projects and how creative works kind of were financed and delivered and toured and all of those things kind of entered into the fray. And what we managed to do, and we think it's the first, and we've never managed to quite get this confirmed, but we got a capital grant from Arts Council England because we created the justification that the data and the relationships would be an asset, and they accepted it. And we think that's the first time ever that's happened. This diagram is a kind of model of data and information, knowledge and wisdom, and talking about how that's not very processed, not very organised. This is a bit more structured. And then, for me anyway, above that line is in humans, below that line is in paper and computers. And just kind of getting that discipline to understand that we have knowledge, and that's an innately human thing. The best that we can get is highly structured information. That's not knowledge. It's knowledge when it's in people's heads. But to turn that into something that people at Arts Admin would understand, believe in and care about, in fact, it kind of shifted around into just realising that if you sort out this stuff, then you end up with people having more time to do the most highly valued task they could possibly, which is to do inspirational work. And that's, in a sense, the pinnacle of the most uniquely human acts that they could perform in a creative organisation. And so, to perhaps less fiendishly exciting things, this is a definition from the International Accounting Standard 38. And when we did a study for the Intellectual Property Office on high growth small to medium enterprises, we insisted on considering cultural enterprises within them. They didn't really want us to, but we did it anyway. And it was just fascinating to see how much of this applied. And so this is how the accountants think about assets, and this is potentially quite important because this will decide whether your accountants will let you put something on the balance sheet of your organisation. And there are some quite good things there. Are you in control? Is it going to create some future economic benefits? Can you identify it? And is it in some sense separable? Because it's totally woven in to the fabric of your organisation and the people. Then strictly speaking, in accounting terms at least, in that model of asset and value, it may not be an asset. And just to realise that perhaps we're going on a journey, or certainly I'm only on the first stage of the journey with you, because in the world of assets, whether it's in the cultural sector, the non-profit sector or the commercial sector, there's a thing that happens about developing and protecting and in fact identifying assets. There's a thing about transacting them, whether that's selling a ticket for someone to go and see a show, whether it's licensing some digital content, whether it's hiring a room and kind of letting someone use a physical asset. And both the kind of idea of selling it to someone else to exploit or you yourself exploiting it, that's a journey. And I think the focus of this residential is all about, in their model, development and protection. And I think partly what we've been doing as well of identifying things that you already have. Just finally, a kind of a word play, but it seems again to kind of work. Everyone cares for their buildings. Everyone has an idea of real estate. I kind of suddenly realise why the Americans call it that. You know, the tangible assets and equipment and stuff like that. But actually, you are all knowledge enterprises. You are all ideas organisations. And even when we did the study for the Intellectual Property Office in 2014, the UK invested more in intangible assets than it did in tangibles, more in ideas and creative things than it did in buildings and factories and equipment. And I'm sure that balance has kind of tipped further. So just being comfortable with the word asset, with the word intangible, about realising that there are so many of your things other than the buildings equipment, and typically the value of those will be much higher than your tangible. You will typically in any one year invest much more in those than you do in your tangible assets. And as a sector, definitely no question. Moving swiftly on. This is a project that we did with G39. If you haven't been to G39, they're based in Cardiff. They're an artist-led gallery. We did it actually with Artist Mundi. And the whole idea of this project was to create relationships and data about audiences that were not ticketed. And this is a whole kind of class of problem that we would say that the sector has generally, which is that you know about the people who've bought tickets. And in fact, that means in a ticketed audience, you tend to know about 42% of the ticket buyers. You tend to know almost nothing about the rest of your audience. The audience agency average group size in ticketed things is 2.3, something like that. And so for G39, for Artist Mundi, and if you didn't see their shows, see the next one, it's just absolutely amazing. And for a local authority-led gallery, we created these apps that would capture people's reaction to artwork. So this is visual art we're in, not performance art. And very much we're trying to kind of get a sense of people's reaction to this rather than asking them a kind of boring questionnaire. And so it's this idea of getting a greater depth of knowledge about the audience and through that being able to enhance their visit and their relationship with the artwork. That's kind of during the visit and immediately afterwards. But over the long term, the relationship with those audiences. And so, in fact, because this writing is really small, you've got one of these printed out. It's in your packs. But just if we're saying that there must be value created, then having a map of how that value is going to be created at different levels. So here we modelled how it would enhance the visitor experience, how it would improve the data that would be collected, how the organisations would be able to do stuff that was new or better with that data, how the venues would actually have an impact on them in terms of resilience and other things, and a kind of sector benefit. And I don't think you've got time to do it in this residential, but these kinds of value maps are really powerful, and in a sense they are the justification that one of the things that you suggest could be an asset is. Because without the map to how you're creating value, it's a potential asset.
Can I ask a quick question?
By all means.
You say it's not a questionnaire. How does it work when it's capturing data?
It asks questions. I suppose I said it's not a kind of boring questionnaire. So it's using some creative content to try and stimulate perhaps a more creative answer. I can tell you more about it afterwards. But it was trying to move away from, we work with the audience agency and love them dearly, but their questionnaires are boring. They're not a creative process. They're a kind of have to do process. And we thought if we wanted to get a bit more insight into what people were really into and cared about, then that wouldn't be via something that was at least perceived to be a traditional questionnaire. Does that kind of make sense? Anyway, it ended up being called iBeholder, and we're actually helping them look for funding to roll it out across organisations in Wales and then the UK. Just thinking on a different tack about a different kind of asset, and this is a part of a talk that I usually give with Michelle, who's the image manager at the Royal Shakespeare Company. So obviously the RSC just has this unique archive. It has many, many pictures of David Tennant, but actually, also a unique set of a documentation of practice, a unique record of all of the productions, something that's very popular on social media. People who are famous now who weren't then, playing Hamlet, and we received a brief which was kind of roughly, we have lots of images, help. And so we started off kind of going, well, some organising principle here, how could we help? How might it be better? And in a sense, how can value be created? And I think the thing that Michelle tends to state in these talks is without the right data, a known rights position, some knowledge of who that person is or what that costume is or what that character is, and without the RSC brand, the image assets are just stuff. In fact, they're not assets. There's something about the combination of the picture with those things that turns it into an asset. And this is a generic theme, I have to say, in our work generally, and in the study that we did for the IPO, which is it's very rarely one thing that really is valuable. It's usually a bundle of things. And I think that was a bit of a eureka for me, even though maybe life had been trying to tell me that with various examples. But it's this idea of that it's the picture with the data, with the rights, with a bit of expertise and a brand. And then that's an asset. And in fact, that it's the collection of images, not each individual image, that becomes the asset. So, and this may be familiar to you, may not, but there's this idea of, as organisations move from physical archives through to having digital objects which are actually surrogates of the physical thing. So you have a picture of a thing, and you have a picture of a production, and a picture of an actor, and a picture of some costume. And then gradually you may have some things that never were physical things. This is the kind of Baudrillard world. We're into this simulacra world of things that were never physical, artwork that was never printed out, images that were never drawn. And I think what we've seen in performing arts, in visual arts, in museums, archives, is that everyone's kind of just tipping into this having to archive the born digital. And it's expensive and a bit complicated. And unless those things move from being stuff to assets, you will not afford to do it. And all of the stuff will be lost. And that feels rather risky to society at large, never mind your individual organisations. We literally will lose the memory of these decades from the last 15 years onwards. I'm sorry, I've actually taken my glasses off, which is really bad.
It's actually also ties into what you just said. I'm just interested in GDPR and this whole thing about images, because we're in exactly this position in our organisation. We've got tons of assets.
Okay.
It's stuff. It's GDPR. It's people don't know who they are even.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And it's just, we're in a process of like, we cannot legally keep that stuff unless we know who it is and the person's given their permission. So I feel like there's going to be a massive dumping of stuff.
Yes. I was trying not to mention GDPR today, but yeah, oh heavens, we're doing 2 events in the next 2 weeks on it, and I need to write my presentation. It came up in conversation yesterday about archives and who is that person, and is this picture personal data, all of those things. Please don't throw it all away just rashly. There are many, many, many causes to hold data which do not need consent. It's a whole other conversation. But there are many legal bases for you holding data which are not consented. And you also need to look at the security of the data or content. You also need to have a way of people, if they ask, you saying what you hold on them. There's a whole set of things that have really cranked up in terms of the obligation on you. And philosophically, it's probably better to talk about philosophically though, we should all be glad, because the legislation tips it to this idea that it's our data. Now in intellectual property rights, that photo that you took of me a few months ago, that's not mine. That's yours. But from a personal data point of view, there's something about the control of it. And I think there's a much greater concern about data than there is necessarily about pictures, excluding minors. But I can talk to you in the break. But GDPR definitely. So I think the equivalent to the point about the RSC images is that if you don't have permission, then all of your personal data is just stuff. Actually, it only is an asset if it's correctly permissioned, and you will have to totally change the permissioning of all of it by May. Otherwise, you'll have to delete it. So anyway, very briefly, in the RSC, the answer was standards. It sounds so boring, but standard ways of doing things, talking of codifying stuff. And the way to motivate people is, first of all, I would suggest in many of these projects to look at the value created by getting your colleagues to use stuff better, the value created by getting people who are similar to you to use your assets better, and then something gone wrong with the font, perhaps some commercial licensing for certain kinds of content. But we know the culture of arts organisations. If you start off with the commercial licensing first, that is not going to inspire anyone. But on the other hand, once you've sorted it out for everyone else to use it, actually you've probably sorted it out enough to license it. And I think we've done those. It is about the creating and the value and the identification of the assets is in the context of your organisation. And so what we were talking about this morning and about understanding personal motivations, organisational motivations is critical. This is some work we did at Royal Opera House. In a way, this is a kind of super, super, super high level to how all creative organisations work and create value. And we have to kind of acknowledge Chloe Lake, who's the business affairs head there, because she kind of collaborated with us on this. But generally, whatever it is, if it's performance or visual art or very hybrid other things, you've got various people who make contributions to various creative works. And if we take opera, then that's the design of a costume or the making of a costume or the choreography of something or the whole musical work or the whole of all the spoken word in the piece or it's the whole production. It kind of operates at lots and lots and lots of different levels of granularity. And in fact, the Royal Opera House will, on some occasions, license a piece of choreography. On the other occasions, it may be actually licensing out the film of a whole opera or excerpts from it. And there's just something about recognising that what we're always doing is trying to fairly recognise and remunerate contributions from a whole number of people in a whole set of kind of, it's those dolls, isn't it, the intersecting dolls. And then there's different ways of expressing those and creating value from it, and hopefully joy and wonder from them, as well as money. And there's a whole set of people things that everything is organised by, and there's a whole set of place things. You know, maybe you can only do that within educational institutions in the UK. Maybe that if it's international, you can charge for it when you couldn't do in the UK. There's all of those kinds of considerations. And so there's a kind of generic model that we came up with, which looks a bit techie, but I'll put in some extra explanations of these. Just this general idea of a creation is kind of whether it's asset, which is something that we've talked a lot about already, and there's recognising there is this other thing which is an ephemeral thing. So that performance of the work is not an asset, because it's something that you'll remember, but it's not capturable. It only becomes an asset when you've filmed it, when you've videoed it, when you've recorded it, when you've done something to it. But it doesn't mean that all those ephemeral outputs aren't really important. So finally, before we do the exercise, one of the things that came up in the work we did with Nesta was just the way innovation works is usually, or not always, but often, by taking an idea from outside a sector and applying it in a new context in a sector. And we believe that as a kind of working method, we believe it, we do it, it's what we do every day in our work, is, I won't say steal, let's say borrow, approaches that are being used from elsewhere and find a way of applying. And it requires some translation. The words may be different, the kind of rhythm of it may be different, the style of it may be different. But for those of you who run buildings that have cafes, then how is the rest of the hospitality sector doing, and what are they doing? For those of you who run things that are visitor attractions in effect, how is the rest of that sector doing? For those of you who are, from the point of view of that some of your funders, perhaps local authorities, providing some public services, then how are other social enterprises who are funded in the same way providing public services? So this is kind of an exhortation to borrow from others. And so this is an opportunity to do a little exercise to limber up the borrowing muscles, to think about the kinds of categories that your users, audiences, visitors, customers, how would they describe what you do? So this isn't thinking about assets, it's thinking about, in a sense, the category of what they might put you in. So they might say, it's a community space. They might say, it's a really nice cafe to go and hang out. They might say, it's a night out. When we work with Miracle Theatre, who purposefully do theatre not in theatres for people who don't go to theatre, the eureka that we had was that in their audience's minds, they were kind of a cross between a gig and a comedy night. Because it was in those kinds of venues, it was kind of like an outside piece of music, it's just that it had theatre instead. But they definitely didn't think of Miracle Theatre as being a theatre company. And because why would they? They're people who don't go to theatre. So it's a game to do in your notebooks or on another piece of paper, to just be playful with the kind of categories of what your customers would describe your organisation as providing. And I won't jump the gun, I'll just let you do that. And in fact, it's 22, so now let's do that in the next 3 minutes, very quick fire. 3 minutes. So that we're hurtling towards the end. I hope that was that was useful. We don't have time to feedback on that right now. But for your reference, and the PDFs of these will be up on this site imminently, or they are the PDFs. So in your packs, there's this, which is the outcome of running that as a workshop for 40 minutes with a gallery, which I've kind of I've summarised here, but it's too small writing to see all the ideas they came up with. So please do take a look at that. Just to remind you, and I'm sure you're going to be doing more stuff on IP and intellectual property, is that there's lots and lots and lots and lots of different kinds of those things. Copyright is not the only thing. There's trademark, there's database rights, and there's copyright in lots and lots of different things. I would just do a plea for something that was a eureka moment when we worked with Theatre of Debate, who often didn't own the rights to the things they'd produced. The big piece of intellectual property that they had was a method for how you did performance pieces around research, medicine, science, and it was their method of how you got the subject matter experts and the writers to work together to make a piece of theatre. And it was totally invisible to Nigel, who's the lovely, lovely creative director. But he kind of went, oh, but I've always done it that way. And I kind of went, no, you haven't. You've been doing it for 25 years and you gradually evolved that. And that's taken you 25 years. And that's the most valuable asset, other than your name and professional reputation, that you have in the whole organisation. But it was totally invisible. So a big plea for kind of creative processes being IP. And again, I kind of make this criticism of the IP crowd. You know, if you speak to lawyers, they will talk in terms of IP. The value isn't in the IP. The value is in thinking about these clumps of stuff which are assets, which may have bits of IP in them. It's different. You know, the picture in the RSC library and the rights in it, that's an asset. The rights on their own and the picture on their own, that's not an asset. We talked about people, audiences. It's a really, really good game. Go and do it with your colleagues. Go and get them to say words that aren't audience or visitor. And in 2 minutes, another really, really rapid fire, without thinking writing, complete these sentences. Don't think about it. Don't talk to your neighbour. Don't edit yourselves. Don't write what you think you should write. Just write out what comes first into your minds. Who wrote something down that surprised them? Go on then. Admit it, admit it.
Exploitation is rife.
Just, I did one of these. It's a great kind of personal and professional development thing. And I had success is far away. Failure is often, you know, all kinds of doom and gloom. Sorry, another one that surprised. Please.
I wrote exploitation is sensible.
Okay, okay, controversial, sorry.
I put selling is half of the course. All selling stuff.
I thought selling is a distribution of an asset.
But true. I know my mum, who was very academically minded and grew up in the war, she hated the idea of selling. I remember, you know, her just having some things around the house, and I said, why don't you sell them? And she just said, I would rather, you know, I just can't even bear the idea of selling. This is why my parents were poor. This is why I'm not a professional musician like my dad, you know. But these beliefs, you actually have them, and they really do direct your behaviour. And I'm not saying they're good or bad, but they're there. Just one more.
I thought exploitation is not a dirty word.
Okay.
It depends who's doing the exploitation.
It does. And for which purpose?
I think it's really generational though. I think young people have a lot of lesson issue about it, especially if you think about music.
Yeah.
I think we as cultural organisations can get caught up in in the idea of exploitation, but actually I think if you're a young person growing up making music, exploitation of that music to make money is key, and actually that natural hustle is much better built in.
It depends if somebody's stolen your property.
It's exploitation of the asset.
Yeah, that's
what I meant by it. Yeah.
Exploitation per se.
I tell you what, if you say creative enterprise in Brazil, or creative industries, or if you say cultural entrepreneur in Brazil, I just come back from a study period there. It's like you've said, banana, dinosaur. That is as much sense as it makes to them. And although there is cognitive dissonance around it here, we are able to think about the two things at the same time. There, they, culturally, in the broad sense of culturally, they're not at all in that intersection of what you might say social enterprise and culture. They're absolutely not there, and it's fascinating. Although the people who work in the Rio town theatre haven't been paid for 6 months, and you might think they might try and find some other ways to make some money, but it's set in our political context. The last thing I would say. Sorry.
I think that's class. That's not my experience of Brazil at all. We work in favelas a lot, and people exploit their cultural assets all the time.
Yeah.
And because they have to, because you've got to sell to to live.
I actually think it is class, and I think what's really interesting is that the educated, privileged people are all for Creative Commons and for all this sharing because they work in universities, and the poor people are all for making money now because I need to earn some money. I think it's very accurate. Anyway, just on that point, there's another reference that I haven't put in my slides, but which will magically appear on the learning management system, which is Lewis Hyde, The Gift. And so I do think that book deals with the cognitive dissonance around, on the one hand, in a sense, economic goods. This is the idea of creative work, either as an economic good or as a cultural expression. And are you an artist or are you a business person? It's wonderful. I really, really, really would encourage you to read it and come back to me and tell you what you think and discuss it with each other, and thank you very much.